Hello again, gamers. Welcome back for another episode of Grokking Twilight Imperium. I'm the board game captain, and today I'm going to be doing a strategic deep dive on the Argent Flight. Now, the Argent Flight are one of the newer factions that were released with the Prophecy of Kings expansion. I want to give a big shout out to one of my viewers, Gunther Frankenberg, for requesting that I cover the Argent Flight in a episode of Grokking Twilight Imperium. So, Gunther Frankenberg, this episode is for you. So, before I get started, I do want to say I've got a ton of links in the description down below that you can check out at your leisure. There's a link to BoardGameCaptain.com, which is a great hub for all things Board Game Captain, as well as a place where Lynn and I have started doing semi-regular blog posts over there. So check that out. There's also a link to my Patreon. If you're in a position to and would like to support the channel, feel free to head over to my Patreon, link in the description down below. And there is a link to my Teespring store if you'd like to get yourself some cool Board Game Captain merch, some cool gamer gear, t-shirts, mugs, etc. You can head over to my Teespring store, link in the description down below. So the Argent Flight, these are some humanoid avian peoples that live out on the edge of the galaxy that are watching for the possible return of the Mech. And now that the Mech have come back in the expansion, they have become active again and are attempting to thwart them and stop them from taking over the galaxy. This is a very interesting faction that plays very differently and very uniquely, and I kind of didn't pay enough attention to them when I first looked over the factions in the Prophecy of Kings. I have to admit, there were a lot of other shiny new factions like the Mech Gene Sorcerers that I was paying a lot closer attention to. And later, when I gave them a second look, I went, wow, these guys are interesting. So without any further ado, let's talk about what makes them so interesting and why I think you might enjoy trying playing the Argent Flight. So first things first, I'd like to talk about what the Argent Flight start with. So the Argent Flight have a 3-planet system. Now, their 3 planets are Airy, Valk, and Avar. Now, they are all fairly light on their statistics each, but combined do add up to a fair amount of resources and influence. So Valk has 2 resources, 0 influence, while Airy has 0 resources, 2 influence, the exact opposite of Valk, and Avar has 1 of each. So it is generally best to put your starting space dock on Valk, which will allow you to start out with the ability to make 4 ships, which isn't great, but they do have an ability that's going to improve that later. Plus, of course, you can go out of your way to try to place a 3-resource planet somewhere in your vicinity of the galaxy or between you and Mech Rex that you will hopefully be able to get and place a space dock on later, which will then have a larger production than your starting system. But all in all, this isn't too bad. You've got 3 resources, 3 influence. It's an okay starting system, not too shabby. So the next thing I want to talk about is their starting fleet. Now here, this is a really interesting starting fleet, and actually, in my opinion, is one of the best top-tier colonizer starting fleets in the entire game. I want to say it one more time. They have one of the best top-tier colonizing fleets in the entire game. And it doesn't seem like it at first when you look at it, but it really is, and I'll explain why. So first off, you have a carrier. You have 2 destroyers. You have 5 infantry. You have 2 fighters. You have a PDS, and you have a space dock. Now, looking at that, you might say, Board Game Captain, have you lost your marbles? How is that a top-tier colonizing fleet? Well, it's because of the 1 unit on their card that is not a standard unit other than, of course, their flagship. They have one of their basic units has been swapped out for a faction-specific unit. Now, the particular unit that was swapped out is their destroyer. Instead of a regular destroyer, they have the Strike Wing Alpha 1. Now, the Strike Wing Alpha 1 is 1 cost, 8 combat, which is as good as an upgraded destroyer for most other factions, 2 movement, capacity of 1. Here's where it really gets amazing. They have a capacity of 1 on their basic destroyers, the Strike Wing Alpha 1, and of course the anti-fighter barrage of 9 times 2, which means that these destroyers are better than upgraded destroyers for most other factions. Really freaking amazing. So you've got a combat capability equal to an upgraded destroyer, and then you have a capacity of 1, which means if you were using that capacity of 1 to carry a fighter, that already makes it even better. Or if you're using that capacity of one to carry a ground troop, like you're going to be with your 2 starting destroyers, you have a carrier that could be carrying 3 ground troops and therefore colonizing a 3-planet system. And you also have 2 destroyers that could each be carrying 1 ground troop each that could split up and colonize 2 1-planet systems. This is really amazing. They could also stay together to colonize a single 2-planet system. But yeah, this is a lot of colonizing power in one starting fleet. It really is pretty fantastic. Next, I'd like to talk about the abilities on the card for the Argent Flight. So the first ability is Zeal. Zeal says, you always vote first during the agenda phase. When you cast at least 1 vote, cast 1 additional vote for each player in the game, including you. This means that at the smallest size game, which is 3 people, you will have 3 free votes as long as you have saved 1 planet to use for voting power for each of the agendas. At least 4 votes. Now, granted, you have to vote first, but it means you're going to have a say-so in what happens in both of the agendas coming up in the agenda phase. And actually, the voting first is a bit of a disability, but the large voting power combined with the fact that you can negotiate with, maybe get one of the other players on your side for one of the agendas, can mean that they are on par with some of the strongest voting power factions in the game, similar to, say, like the Ixcha kingdoms. They have a lot of extra voting power. Really cool. Really good once you get into the nitty-gritty of the politics, once the agenda phases start happening around mid-game. Their second ability is Raid Formation, and in my opinion, this is the more wow factor of the 2 abilities. So Raid Formation says, when 1 or more of your units use anti-fighter barrage, for each hit produced in excess of your opponent's fighters, choose one of your opponent's ships that has sustained damage to become damaged. Now, this is really awesome, combined with the fact that these guys have some of the best destroyers in the game, which get even better with one of their technology upgrades, their faction-specific technologies, which I'm going to get to in a minute, because the best destroyers in the game get even better in a moment. This is a phenomenal ability. So the thing is, if you've got a bunch of destroyers in a fleet, and you're able to blast away enough that the number of fighters in the enemy fleet are completely wiped out and you have extra damage left over. If your opponent has any dreadnoughts, a flagship, or war sons in that fleet, you can damage them before the combat even begins. And then when they start taking regular hits, their sustained damage units are already damaged. And they lost all their fighters, so they're not going to be able to absorb hits on the fighters. This is amazing. This can allow you to have fleets of tiny ships, things like destroyers and cruisers, wipe out fleets of dreadnoughts, flagships, and war sons. Really, really cool. I definitely like this ability a lot, and it very much, again, changed with the upgraded version of the Strike Alpha 1, which actually, I think I'm going to get into the faction-specific tech right now, so I can explain why. So the Argent Flight have 2 faction-specific techs. They have a basic one requirement yellow tech, which they do start with 1 yellow tech on the board that I'm going to talk about in a minute. So this tech can be gotten immediately, and they have a upgrade to the Strike Alpha 1, which requires 2 reds, and they do start with 1 red tech on the board, so all you really need to do is get 1 more red tech or a red technology specialty, and you'll be able to get the Strike Wing Alpha 2 out. So not too hard. These are both going to come out fairly early game. So the yellow tech, the basic yellow tech they've got, is the Airy Hollow Lattice. Now the Airy Hollow Lattice is other players cannot move ships through systems that contain your structures. Each planet that contains 1 or more of your structures gains the Production 1 ability as if it were a unit. Now here's the thing. Giving your structures Production 1 means your space docks go up 1 in the amount of units they can produce. So your starting space dock goes from a production of 4 to a production of 5, which goes from meh to respectable. So suddenly, you've got a heck of a lot of production going on in your home system, and in future systems that you set out space docks and PDSs on, you're going to have extra production as well. Now, the other technology is their upgrade to the Strike Wing Alpha 1. It is the Strike Wing Alpha 2. So the Strike Wing Alpha 2, the first thing it does is it ups the combat capability from 8 to a 7, meaning that the Strike-Wing Alpha 2 is actually the exact same combat capability as a basic cruiser, which is not bad at all. And then it also gains 2 extra advantages in its abilities. One is that the anti-fighter barrage changes. The Strike-Wing Alpha 1 has, remember, anti-fighter barrage of a 9 times 2. It changes to a 6 times 3. Now this upgraded version of the Strike-Wing Alpha 1, getting a 6 times 3 combined with the raid formation, is deadly. Every one of your fleets should have 2 destroyers in it, because once you get those to be 2 Strike-Wing Alpha 1s, that's 6 rolls that hit on 6s or better. That is crazy good. And once again you've wiped out the fighters, you also are getting to cause the sustained damage ships of your opponent's fleets to become damaged. So once the actual shooting starts, they're gonna have to destroy those ships, and that is really awesome. Now the next cool thing it has is it has an ability that says when this unit uses anti-fighter barrage, each result of a 9 or a 10 also destroys one of your opponent's infantry in the space area of the active system. So you actually aim for where the infantry are held on the ships, and you open those areas to the vacuum of space and wipe out a bunch of their infantry. This is a great way to throw hit-and-run tactic strikes with just a handful of destroyers on a big fleet to wipe out a lot of the ground troops they're carrying, so that when they get to their destination, they don't have enough ground troops left to take your planets. If you don't think you can wipe them out completely, this is a great way to take out a good amount of their invasion fleets with your defensive small fleets of destroyers. Really, really good. Next, I want to talk about the starting technologies that you get for the Argent Flight. Since I've already referenced that you had one red and one yellow, you also have one green. So I'm going to throw out there that you have the plasma scoring for red, which says when one or more of your units use bombardment or space cannon, one of those units may roll 1 additional die. So this is really good since you're going to have a bunch of space cannons around. You may get bombardment if you decide to make some dreadnoughts later yourself, or eventually get the War Sun tech and decide to make some War Suns yourself. You are going to be able to easily get the War Sun tech because of the technologies I'm going to be recommending to you, so I'll get into that in just a moment. But then also you start with the yellow tech Sarween tools. When one or more of your units use production, reduce the combined cost of the produced units by 1. So we've already talked about that you're going to have a bunch of space docks and PDSs everywhere, giving you a bit of production all over the place. If you just throw some PDSs down, even without space docks, when you activate that system, for any reason, you get to produce one thing for 1 cost for free, and you could just do that, and that'd be great. And you can do that anywhere you've got one of your PDSs, so that is really awesome. In addition, of course, when you're making a big fleet, you also get to reduce the cost by 1, which means you can choose larger ships and larger units in that fleet. For instance, their Mech, versus just getting some ground troops. The last of their starting techs is the Neural Motivator. During the status phase, draw 2 action cards instead of 1. Okay, more action cards is better. This is always a great tech to start with. Action cards have all sorts of awesome tricksy abilities that you can use to help you win combat or help you gain objectives and gain points. So action cards are great. Getting extra action cards is great. Plus, getting to start with 1 technology of each of the 3 green, yellow, and red colors is also awesome, because you already start with a lot of prerequisites that you can use towards getting certain unit upgrades and certain other things, other technologies later in the game. Next, I'd like to talk about the flagship for the Argent Flight. Now, the flagship for the Argent Flight is the Quetzalcoatl, named after the deity of the Aztec religions, who could take on the form of a winged serpent. Very characterful for this faction. So now it is an 8 cost, 2 attacks at a 7, which makes it roughly equivalent in combat to a pair of cruisers or a pair of Strike Alpha Wing 2s. It has a movement of 1 and a capacity of 3. A lot of that is pretty standard. It's got sustained damage, also pretty standard. It has a fairly interesting ability, though. It says other players cannot use space cannon against your ships in this system. So making a fleet that is headed up by the Quetzalcoatl and is backed up by some destroyers or some other, or cruisers or other ships of yours, and you need to, say, get into an area of your opponent's wedge of the galaxy where they have a ton of PDS or PDS trickery, because maybe your opponents are playing the Extra Kingdom or the Ghosts of Cruz, for instance, who can do lots of trickery with PDS fire to hit you with a lot of PDSs. You have the flagship with you, and you're going to ignore all those PDSs. Now, it is a situationally useful ability, but in those situations, when playing against certain factions, this can be a really decent flagship to head up a fleet for invading your opponent's pie wedge of the galaxy. Next, I'd like to talk about the Agent, Commander, Hero, and Mech abilities, because they are really awesome, and they really help out with a lot of these other abilities that the Argent Flight has going on. So first off, of course, you start with the Agents. The Agent says, when a player produces ground forces in a system, you may exhaust this card. That player may place those units on any planets they control in that system or in adjacent systems. This allows you to do those quick builds, making ground forces. And remember, ground forces include mechs and infantry, and you can put them in adjacent systems closer to where your carriers are to help you to pick them up, or to where your destroyers are, for instance. This is a really good ability. It gives you a nice little step up in logistics in the galaxy, because you even your starting system, you can start one planet away from there and more easily swoop over and pick them up with some of your fast-moving upgraded cruisers or upgraded destroyers, etc. And as we're going to be talking about the Mech in a minute, the Mech has an ability where you are going to want to swoop by and pick it up with your upgraded destroyers and cruisers. But we'll get to him momentarily, because first we're going to talk about the Commander. So the Commander for the Argent Flight is Trakan Aun Zulak. He is unlocked when you have 6 units that have anti-fighter barrage, space cannon, or bombardment on the game board. Now, you're going to be building tons of destroyers, so this is not going to be hard to get. You're going to very quickly have 6 units out on the game board that can do this. Once you unlock him, he gives you the ability, when one or more of your units make a roll for a unit ability, you may choose one of those units to roll an additional die. Now remember, Anti-Fighter Barrage is a unit ability. Once you have those upgraded Strikewing Alpha 2s, you can give it an extra die. Later on in the game, when you get out your War Sons, you can do that with their bombardments, give an extra die for bombardment. This is a fantastic ability, and like all commander abilities, of course, does not exhaust, which means you can do this every time when one or more of your units make a roll for a unit ability. So every time you're doing Anti-Fighter Barrage, you get 1 more die. Every time you're doing bombardment, you get 1 more die, and that is pretty freaking amazing. So last of the 3 characters, we have the Hero. Now the Hero, of course, like all heroes, is unlocked when you have 3 scored objectives. The Hero is Mirik Aun Sisiri, Flight Master. When they are unlocked, they become Helix Protocol Flock Migration. Action. Move any number of your ships from any systems to any number of other systems that contain one of your command tokens and no other player's ships. Then purge this card. This can be a fantastic way to amass an enormous fleet for attacking something if you have managed to get your fleet supply large enough to handle it. You can move in with a huge fleet and just really mix it up and wipe out a big enemy fleet. Really could be a game-winning ability in conjunction with having the right ships, of course. It is going to be situational. It's not as overtly game-winning as some of the other hero abilities, but I quite like this hero ability, and I could see a lot of uses for this for attacking key planets, including Mechatol Rex, where you first amass everything right next to it, then use Warfare to remove the token and move everything in. And boom, Mechatol Rex is yours. So yeah, Helix Protocol, really good. Last over here on this side card, we have the Mech. Now, the Mech is very interesting, and this is something you're going to want to build all of your mechs. You're going to have them all out on the board, and here's why. This unit does not count against the capacity if it is being transported or if it is in the space area with one or more of your ships that have capacity values. Otherwise, it's pretty normal at 2 cost, 6 combat, and sustained damage. It is a normal mech otherwise. But basically, if you've got a bunch of destroyers, and let's say you put fighters on them to help them take hits for them so they don't die right away for when they're attacking enemy fleets, those destroyers can also hold any number of these mechs for you. So once you're done fighting your enemy fleet, you've got a bunch of mechs that you can use to drop in on their planets. And that is really, really awesome, especially since even though you have a ton of ships that can hold a lot of capacity, you're going to want to make a lot of that capacity fighters to take hits for them because they are smaller ships that you want to fight in a swarm with against bigger ships. So being able to take those hits on the fighters is going to be pretty key. Okay, so we already went over the awesome selection of 3 starting techs you have, plus the awesome faction-specific technologies, both of which I definitely recommend you get. But what other techs do I recommend that you get? Now, there's only 4 techs I'm going to recommend here, and you can easily get all of these out during the game. It is definitely feasible and possible. Some I recommend more than others. There are plenty of other techs that do work very well for the Argent Flight, but they don't necessarily work better for the Argent Flight than they do for any other faction. But there are a lot of other options around there if you want to make a variation of this strategy yourself. There are plenty of other techs that will work well. But the first one I'm going to recommend is the self-assembly routines. Now, you've already got 1 red tech with your plasma scoring out, which is what is required for the self-assembly routines, and this will give you enough reds to be able to get your Strikewing Alpha 2 out, which is really good. So the self-assembly routine says, after 1 or more of your units use production, you may exhaust this card to place 1 mech from your reinforcements on a planet you control in that system. After 1 of your mechs is destroyed, gain 1 trade good. You want to get lots of your mechs out. I've already talked about that. An extra technology that lets you get tons of mechs out is awesome. So I think that is great. Now, once you get this out and you can get, and you've already got the plasma scoring out, and then if maybe you've gotten 1 red technology specialization on 1 of your planets, is all you would need to be able to get out the assault cannon, the top tier red tech. Now, keep in mind, I'm not recommending another red tech here, because you could either get a red technology specialty or any other red tech to be named later. There are plenty of other red techs that would work well for the Argent Flight, but specifically the assault cannon works really well for them, and I do want to recommend it if you can get your hands on it. At the start of space combat, in a system that contains 3 or more of your non-fighter ships, your opponent must destroy 1 of their non-fighter ships. This again helps you to swarm up on them with lots of small ships, which the Argent Flight like to do, to cause them to wipe out 1 of their ships before the combat even begins. And then, after they wiped out 1 of their ships, you're also going to cause them to wipe out all of their fighters and cause all of their sustained damage ships to get damaged. So they're going to wind up being severely weakened before you even start rolling dice. So yeah, Assault Cannon is going to be really awesome. Now again, if you can't get a red technology specialty, get any other red tech that you can get to be named later. There are lots of other great red techs. 1 technology, this one you can take or leave, but it is pretty cool, and starting at the very beginning of the game, you can immediately get this out, is the upgrade to the cruiser to get the Cruiser Mark II. Now, once you get Strikewing Alpha 2s, there's no reason to build Cruiser Mark 1s because they're basically weaker than the Strikewing Alpha 2s. However, if you upgrade the cruiser to Cruiser 2, you get to get its combat down to a 6 and its movement up to a 3, where suddenly you have a reason to take these in addition to Strikewing Alpha 2s, because they are faster and they are better at hitting in combat. Sure, they don't have that awesome anti-fighter barrage ability, but if you've managed to keep your fleet supply large enough, you can have a cruiser or 2 with your a couple of Strikewing Alpha 2s and really mix it up. And with that carrying capacity, you can do the same thing you're doing with your Strikewing Alpha 2s. You can have a fighter on here and also be holding some of the mechs to be able to invade planets with it. Finally, if you have gotten your technology red specialty and you've got your plasma scoring out from the beginning and you've already built your self-assembly routines and your assault cannon, guess what? You have all the prerequisites needed to build a War Sun. The War Sun tech is 3 reds and 1 yellow for its prerequisites. Once you build it, of course, War Suns have a cost of 12. They get 3 shots that hit on 3s or better, movement of 2, capacity of 6, a bombardment of 3 shots that hit on 3s or better, sustained damage, and other players' units in this system lose planetary shield so that they can still hit them with that bombardment. Getting the War Sun tech out is fantastic. I kind of feel like when you're playing the Argent Flight, you should avoid making Dreadnoughts and go straight for the War Suns instead, since you're going to be getting the techs that are exactly the prerequisites needed for making the War Suns, and then you really won't need the Dreadnoughts. Instead, you should have lots of fleets of little guys, and then a handful of big ships, one of your Quetzalcoatl flagship and a couple of War Suns out there to help reinforce your borders, because these things are really scary, and once you're able to get them out, people are going to be deathly afraid of running into a fleet of a War Sun, 2 Strike Wing Alpha 2s, and 1 Mark II cruiser. That would be absolutely devastating, especially since they're going to bring a ton of fighters with them as well. Be a really tough nut to crack. Next, I want to talk about what strategy cards I recommend that you get when you are playing the Argent Flight. Which are the best ones to get from this? So the first thing I want to talk about is leadership. I definitely want to recommend leadership. This is something you should try to get a hold of either the first or second round if you are able to, and it's because you want to increase your fleet supply. You also want to have a lot of extra strategy and tactic tokens. You're going to want to keep that supply as large as possible. You're going to want to have large fleet supplies because you're going to have a lot of fast-moving ships that you're going to be able to converge on areas where threats are coming towards your side of the galaxy. So again, being able to get the leadership, you get 3 command tokens, plus you can spend 3 influence per extra command token you get. So getting the second round would be really good. But if you get a first round, if you see the opportunity, you might as well get it. You don't want to pass up on it and then not be able to get it the second round. So this would be fine. In addition, technology is really good to get early game because while there are not a huge amount of techs that specifically work with the Argent Flight, there's a bunch you want to get out early if you can. So technology would be really good. To a lesser extent, of course, warfare is good because it'll help you colonize a lot faster. Later, not really the first couple of rounds, but later, once you spread out a little bit, construction is good because it'll let you get those PDSs and space docks out there, which you're going to want lots of places to build from, to build your tons of little fleets all over the place. And in building those tons of little fleets, don't forget you are using a ton of tactic tokens, which means you're going to need that leadership again at some point to refill it, and also keep your ability of having at least, you want to, minimum in my opinion, have 4 in your fleet supply so you can converge on an area with 4 ships. And even though your ships will be smaller on average until you get War Suns out, you will outnumber your opponent and therefore make them a little bit afraid of you in that regard. And once you have the Strike Wing Alpha 2s, of course, you'll be doing all that trickery with the anti-fighter barrage. In addition, of course, things like Imperial to get yourself some extra secret objectives, and occasionally when you really need it, diplomacy to help defend areas. But also late game, you're going to want to be doing a lot of politics because you do have a lot of political sway. You're going to want to set up the agendas that you want to have happen on the top of the political deck. And plus, getting extra action cards is also going to be pretty awesome. Okay, so finally, what secret objectives are you trying to find when you're using the secondary or primary ability of the Imperial card? What objectives are really good for the Argent Flight? So first one I want to talk about is form a spy network, discard 5 action cards. So here's the thing, you start with Neural Motivator out, you're going to be getting 2 action cards instead of 1. That's really good. And then in addition, later when you're taking the politics card, you're going to get a bunch of extras. Being able to discard 5 action cards will not be very hard for you. It's something you're going to be able to do pretty early. And it's a good way to use action cards that you don't have a use for. Next, we have Adapt New Strategies, own 2 faction techs. Your faction techs, one you start with the ability to get right away, and the other you only have to get 1 other tech before it. You're going to get them out fairly easy. This is one you're going to be able to get fairly early game. Next, we have Drive the Debate. You are a planet you control or elected by an agenda. Again, you have extra voting power. That's really good. At some point, you should get elected by an agenda, or a planet you control should get elected by an agenda. So yeah, this is a really, really good card for you. Next, we have Dictate Policy. There are 3 or more laws in play. With all that extra voting power, you're going to be taking politics a lot late game once the agenda phase starts happening. So yeah, that should happen. You should have 3 or more laws in play at some point. Next, we have Master the Laws of Physics. Own 4 technologies of the same color. So I recommended 3 red techs to you. If you manage to get this one, just get another red tech to be named later. Easy to do. Next, we have Demonstrate Your Power. Have 3 or more non-fighter ships in the active system at the end of space combat. Again, you're going to be trying to have larger ships than the average player. You're going to try to have your fleet supply at 4 or maybe even 5 or 6. You want to have a really large fleet supply so that you can swarm in and hit with lots of little ships. So this is something you're going to be able to achieve easily. Next, we have Occupy the Fringe. Have 9 or more ground forces on a planet that does not contain one of your space docks. Now remember, you have the ability from your agent where you can exhaust it to make your ground troops appear when you make them in a adjacent system to where they were produced. So you can easily build up 9 or more ground forces on a planet where there is no space dock. If you get this one, you just have to specifically do that for a few rounds of building to be able to get it done. Next, we have Fight with Precision. Use anti-fighter barrage to destroy the last of a player's fighters in a system. There is no faction better suited to achieving fight with precision than the Argent Flight. Once you have your Strike Wing Alpha 2s, which I think you should have before the end of the early game period, this is going to be highly achievable. Next, we have Control the Region. Have 1 or more ships in 6 systems. You're going to want to spread out with lots of fleets of small ships because of their high maneuverability of specifically the Strike Wing Alpha 2s and the Cruiser and Cruiser Mark 2s. Which can move very quickly because the Strike Wing Alpha 2s have a movement of 2 and the Cruiser Mark 2s have a movement of 3. And then if you see danger coming, you come swarming into that side of the area from all around it into one big fleet to present a unified front against your enemy's fleet that is coming to invade you. So this is going to be very achievable. So there you have it. Those are my ideas on playing the Argent Flight. I think you should have lots of swarms of little ships carrying fighters and carrying mechs, or maybe some of them carrying ground troops spread throughout your wedge of the galaxy all along the different fronts, and lots of fast maneuverable ships. Later in the game, you'll even have your flagship and a couple of Warsons out spread out in different sides of your pie wedge of the galaxy. And then when your opponent starts coming towards you, you're going to swarm in with tons of ships. You're going to wipe out their fleet with your trickery, with your anti-fighter barrage, and then just fighting them and gunning them down. And then you're going to move into their pie wedge of the galaxy, which they have now made a big weak spot because they have ground against you with their fleet and destroyed their own fleet, not realizing how powerful your small ships can be in large numbers. And you're going to take some of their planets from them so that they know what happens when they mess with the Argent Flight. There you have it. If I missed anything and you'd like to tell me about it, feel free to comment down below. If you'd like to request that I cover a specific faction of Twilight Imperium 4th Edition in a future episode of Grokking Twilight Imperium, feel free to comment down below. And if you enjoyed this episode of Grokking Twilight Imperium and you'd like to see me do more like it, be sure to give it a like, share it on all forms of social media, and if you haven't already, please subscribe to the Board Game Captain. That's Captain spelled with a K on YouTube. And until next time, game on.